In today's world, a young black queer person can just cut on any form of social media and find someone who looks like themselves, from influencers to politicians to even major pop stars. Back in my day, in the 90s, in the dark ages when I was growing up, I couldn't find any queer representation really. But does that mean things are changing for our youth? There's alarming statistics about how black queer kids feel in schools and places they're supposed to feel safe. It's great to see a black boy on the red carpet having full access and agency over themselves, but how realistic is that in today's world, in today's school system, and even rural places and southern places? Today we are talking about our future, our gay babies, our millennials, our Gen Z, and even Generation Alpha and beyond. You have Micah Marquez and Leon Curry back again with another deviant conversation. So Micah, how do you feel about the state of black queer youth now?
Whew. So I have some statistics here on black queer youth. According to Chaplain Hall at the University of Chicago, youth are 120% higher risk of reporting homelessness than cishet youth. A quarter of all adolescent suicide attempts are queer youth. 50% of non-binary and trans youth will attempt suicide. When I hear those statistics and that data that's been garnered, it's still alarming, you know. More than alarming, it's disheartening to be a part of this community, even knowing how far we've been able to come and actualize our lives, and knowing that our youth are still in these very serious predicaments. You know, when we talk about suicide, when we talk about homelessness, those things impact the rest of your life, and they really do determine the outcome of your life sometimes, or whether you're going to even have a life.
Yeah, and it's scary that even with more representation and even more acceptance, I feel like there is more acceptance within the community. I don't want to make homophobia inherently black thing, but we are talking about black kids right now. And there's been a study done by GLSEN, along with a study partner, the National Black Justice Coalition, where they find that 2 in 5 queer kids are having anti-black and homophobic remarks said to them in school. 51% don't feel safe in school. 97% hear gay used in a negative term.
Yeah. When you said hearing gay used negatively, I'm like, still? Because everything when we were growing up was "that's so gay."
Yeah, and it also makes me feel like I never thought of that as a statistic or as a thing because it was so normal.
Right.
Like, that's gay. It was slang,
Yeah.
but it is harmful.
And I think what this illustrates for us, right, is that larger policy and even larger policy does not necessarily impact the structures that we have to interact with on a daily basis as black folks. We still gotta go to our own church, our own homes, our own schools, and operate within our own communities.
Yeah.
And we live within a subculture from white-dominated society.
Yeah.
So just because marriage equality was passed, what did that do to actually make our lives any safer, any more equitable? And certainly, we're not just us as adults, but what did it do for our youth who have no choice of where they're going to be and who they're going to be around?
Yeah, and studies show that basically there's no support. If a black queer person is having trouble in school, that's on you. Usually the victim is the one who is being blamed.
Yeah, you're going to be persecuted.
Yeah, and there's no counselors, there's not resources, and when you go and look on the internet to find a resource, today there might be something, but nothing that's accessible to a 12-year-old that they can understand and regurgitate. What did you have growing up trying to find something in this internet age?
Yeah, what did I have as a youth to identify with?
Or just to make you feel a part of something?
I mean, to make me feel a part of something, I had sports, I had friend groups in family, but I guess even as I name those things, one thing that does come to mind is that I was hiding from all those people. I was still lying to them about who I really was and my sexual identity, and I was still lying to myself even, putting on for everybody who is perceived to be the closest to me, and that was hella harmful to those relationships, but also hella harmful to me.
Yeah, and I think even though we have this age where it seems the 12-year-old, the 10-year-olds are more self-actualized, they're actually going through just the same amount of abuse.
Yeah.
And I hope that doesn't plant a seed of trauma in them, because like to come out and live in your house as a preteen or an adolescent is revolutionary.
Yeah.
We don't think of abuse in forms of I've been hiding myself for so long until I was 20-something, until I was 30-something, but that's a form of abuse, and that often starts at home.
Absolutely. I mean, what has to go on in your mind as a child to know that when I come home, I'm going to change up this, or if daddy or mommy walks in the door, I got to immediately, take this off or turn this off. As we're even talking about this, I'm reminded of the first time I did that. I think I was, maybe 6 or 7 years old.
Oh, wow.
With a room full of friends at my house. I lived in Georgia at the time, Riverdale, Georgia. And I think I had a sheet tied around, one tied around my waist,
yeah,
and
you
the other
had
on
your
my
little
head.
lace front
And I guess
on.
it was my first little drag show as a kid, but it wasn't even that. We were just kids having fun. But I remember, we're all laughing as I'm like, walking around the room. Even my brother was there. It wasn't a big thing, right? But as soon as my dad walked in the door, I immediately whipped in, got in the closet, took everything off.
You got back in the closet.
And at 6 and 7 years old, I already knew and was trained I would get my ass beat if my dad saw me this way.
Welcome back, Deviants. Here we are again for another in-depth conversation, this time centering around our future generations. We're here with Jonathan Likes, who is an artist, activist, academic, and much more. I'm going to let you list who you are so I don't miss anything.
Sure. At the very current moment, I'm the executive director of Liberation House, and I direct partnerships for my beloved former professor, Dr. Kathy Cohen, with Black Youth Project and the Gen Forward Survey.
And you're also a part of the legendary House of Garcon.
Yes.
I know we practice the chant upstairs, but I don't have the rhythm to do it, so we're going to just skip it. But what I didn't know is that they have an activism leg of it, and that's CDG Pro. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I'm a founding member of CDG Pro. CDG Pro started about 4 years ago, and essentially, we know that people in the house and ballroom community are already community organizers. Like, they've been organizing for the last 100 years. But our goal is really to bring the house and ballroom community into this moment of the movement for Black lives. So when we think about the radical change that's been happening from Trayvon Martin to now, when we think about all of the uprisings that's been taking place, where is the house and ballroom community in that discourse and in that conversation? So in CDG Pro, we talk about the world and how we want to change it, how we want to build it, but it's also about, like, how do we support our fellow house members as family? How do we do job training? How do we make sure that we're giving attention to healing justice? How are we healing ourselves and working through our trauma? So it's a space of cultivating family, and that's what CDG Pro is about, and that's what the House of Garcon is all about.
All right, that's chosen families or families of choice. And I would imagine that there are a lot of young people and it's youth-centered. And even though this is Gen Z focused, you brought up a good point of Generation Alpha, which are the people who are being born possibly tonight, who we also have to fight for, our little gay babies.
Absolutely.
How important is it to cultivate Black joy, especially in a time and a political climate like this?
Yeah. So I see Black joy as our political resistance. It is not only something that we need to deem necessary, but it's absolutely critical to our survival as Black queer people. We need joy to live. But when it comes to cultivating the importance of queer family and chosen family in our communities, it really is up to us to center narratives of political resistance. We need to center narratives of healing from our trauma. And we need to center narratives of what does it truly mean to be family? What is the political commitment that we're making to each other as we commit to familiar undertakings with each other?
And I know that activism work takes time, and I feel like especially in Black and brown communities, you were saying a cycle of activism is about 5 years, where we could imagine it as 50 years into 1,000 years in the future, what we would look like, what would those children look like. And you use the term radical imagination in that. And can you explain a little bit of this?
So a couple things. When you introduced this conversation to me, just as a conversation about Gen Z, I was like, well, that's a little limiting to me for a couple reasons. One, I come out of the nonprofit space where we're always trying to talk about 5 to 10 year strategic plans. And I'm like, if I have to put together another 5 to 10 year strategic plan, like I'm gonna
Scream.
yes, very loudly. I think it's important for us to think longer and broader about the world we're trying to create. So we need to extend our imaginations to think about the next 50 to 100 years. So that's what I would always say, like, how are we thinking about the next 50 to 100 years of the world we want to live in and the changes we want to make to the world? And then I interacted with a Native American indigenous activist here. What she does is goes on to reservations and provides lighting on reservations without electricity in America. But she said, Jonathan, I think it's critical that we think 1,000 generations into the future. And my mind, it just blew my mind to think, one, what will the world be 1,000 generations from now? But what opportunity does that give us to tap into our radical imaginations and dream up the world that we want for our future lineage? So yes, Gen Z, we know you're here. You're already adults. Y'all ain't like as millennials. Gen Z is, y'all not that young, okay?
Yeah, we're talking about people now. And a generation is 10 years. So we're talking about 1,000 times 10. So we'll be long gone. So we're setting the groundwork for it now. What do you think being Black and queer and young will look like? I'm not gonna say 10 generations, but maybe 2 generations, 1 generation.
Sure. So I hope that we're living in a world where people can joyfully live out their self-determined lives without limitations or barriers. I hope that we're living in a world, I'm a police abolitionist, I don't believe in police. I think they only cause harm and systems of punishment. So I hope that we can begin to conjure up a world that is not based on punishing each other, but a world that's based on us being able to create new formations, new system, new ways of thinking, and new ways of dealing with conflict with each other that doesn't rely on putting people in cages.
And in talking about systems, because foster care is a system, and you were saying that's a hindrance to a lot of Black queer youth. Can you expound more on that for us?
Yeah, so foster care, so when I think of systems, I think of deep end systems. So there are 4 deep end systems that usually cause more harm to Black and brown queer people. So I think of criminal justice systems, housing and homelessness systems, child welfare systems, and mental health systems. These are spaces where when we interact with them, like how white supremacy works in our society, like it's not a mistake, it's not by happenstance. These are intentional state-sanctioned formations of violence. Where
against Black and brown
against
and
Black and
people.
brown and indigenous people, absolutely. So when you think of the creation of, say, the child welfare system, this is a system that rips Black children from their families under the guise of neglect, when oftentimes neglect is just people living in poverty. So you have oftentimes white social workers going into Black communities and taking Black children from their parents, unnecessarily so. So when I think about just the perpetual violence that happens on Black queer kids that go into child welfare systems, I'll give you a scenario. There's a Black trans woman, age 15, living in a Midwestern state. We'll keep the state ambiguous. But she had to leave her house because she ran away. She came out as trans, and she ended up being in a congregate care system. This is a Black trans woman who identifies as a woman. She was put in an all-male group home. So she is getting into fights with people in the all-male group home. What does the group home do? They often call the police on her.
On her?
Yes, on her. So she has to, obviously, who's gonna stay in that environment? She leaves the group home and is now couch surfing with people she met on the internet. So when we think about the multiple levels of engagements, how could we build a system that would support this young Black trans woman instead of like perpetual layers of taking away her dignity, taking away her humanity. So there's so many systemic failures. So I think that as Black, queer, and trans activists and organizers and radical thinkers, we are not waiting for white supremacy to be over. We're not waiting for some magical day for us to try to experience liberation. In the midst of fighting against white supremacy, I think we're creating our own systems at the same time. So when we think about these informal networks of family, like the House of Garcon, and there are many, like in Chicago, they have like just something called like families that are just like, they host parties and raise money together. But when we think about the importance of us building our own systems to fill in that gap. So when we go back to the experience of this Black trans woman, how many times did our government fail her? And what can we do to build our own systems that support each other?
And what does building a system that doesn't replicate more harm look like, especially if it's not regulated, especially if we're dealing with minors and people who we may not have outreach to? How can we do that in a healthy way? Because she's 15 now. 5 more years, she'll be grown. So what is she growing up with? What kind of support can she find?
It's difficult. And I think we have to, as resilient Black queer communities, we have always been experimenting with ways that we can survive together. So I locate the house and ballroom community as the most consistent form of support for younger people. If you think of the creation of the Kiki scene, the Kiki scene was created specifically for Black and queer teenagers that needed a safe space to go to, that needed family connection. So these kind of informal networks of support, I think, are critical. But what we also have to fight for, all our money is going towards the systems that are causing more violence in our lives. So how do we create a world where our resources, where our tax dollars are actually going towards our own freedom, towards our own liberation, towards our own self-determination, and not towards systems that are bringing more harm and violence into our lives?
Do you think that's something we'll see in our lifetime?
Is what something we'll see in our lifetime?
Just the creation of these systems, like our dollars are already in this system.
So I think systems of liberation already exist. They are everywhere we look. Like, we are living in them, we are breathing in them. Will tax dollars go to those systems? No, not in our lifetime. Can we be creative enough to find the resources and find the ability to change the material conditions of people's lives in our community? Yes, absolutely, it's happening all the time. I think the one thing that we need to focus on is land. We need land. As long as we can get land, we can be self-determined and we can build our own societies. Like, I really want us as a community to begin to think, what do we want the world? If we could like start over and create our own world, what would we want it to look like? It's not this. It's not this at all. So I just want us to know that we have the power, we have the ability, we have the resources to make something new that actually doesn't just work for some people, but something that works for everyone.
And on that note, I wanted you to leave a message for like a 10-year-old queer person, or even a queer person born tonight who has no idea what the world has in store for them. A message of hope, maybe, or a real message, something that that's something realistic that they would come into.
Absolutely. If I was talking to a Black queer young person, I would say, number one, you are beautiful, you are valuable, you are brilliant, and you will usher in the world that we want to see. We are hoping to plant the seeds to cultivate a better world for you. But regardless if that world comes into fruition or not, you will bring joy, love, and dignity to this world, and you are walking in that lineage.
Well, amen. You have blessed me with it too. Well, thank you so much. It was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Appreciate it.
Black boys don't have access to softness, and I think that later down the line, that leads to being not emotionally accessible. It's great to see this new era of parenting we're coming in, which social media also helps. I know they're having the discussion about should little boys have kitchen sets. I love to see even our celebrity parents stepping out and saying, if you fuck with my child, I'm gonna fuck with you.
Yes, yeah. Speaking of those celebrity parents who I admire so much, Dwayne Wade and Gabrielle Union Wade, I think are amazing in what they're doing and allowing their black children to be free and actualize who they are. Hearing Dwayne Wade speak about his role as a black father is such a beautiful thing. He's not doing the typical authoring his child's life, but rather sitting in the passenger seat and asking his child, hey, where do you want to go? Who do you want to be, and how can I support you? I wish that our parental systems in the black community were like that, but we know all too well that they're not.
But with Dwayne being a sports star, something black men can look up to, let's hope that if people have queer children, because it was so beautiful that Zaya didn't even have any idea of homophobia until they watched Pose. And I was like, okay, fuck that up. That's great. I couldn't even imagine. I could not imagine having a self that didn't know you shouldn't be doing this.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that would be remarkable because, as we know, growing up as black queer youth, there are so many calculated rules that you begin to learn at such an early age, right? And that's first with dealing with whiteness. And I think, and I'm saying first with whiteness, but also it may actually begin with being queer. I think we learn what we have to hide at a very early age at home first. And then we begin navigating whiteness in larger society. So we are doing mental gymnastics from the time we're 5.
That's making you crazy. I remember walking around in my neighborhood in Harlem and seeing 2 young kids holding hands, little boys, and that didn't have to mean anything, or it could have meant something, but just to see it, I was like, they don't feel any ways about it, and I'm proud of that. I don't want to be the weird, creepy old guy being like, you be gay. But I can imagine them as not even in their 20s. I can imagine them as 19, 18. I can imagine them as 40-something, just having this whole person that they got to play and develop their whole life with.
Yeah, and it would be beautiful if that were a love story. It also would be beautiful if they were just allowed full autonomy as a human to just be, you know? And I wish that was the story of black queer youth or black youth in general, right? I also, another celebrity family that I really admire are the Smiths. I look at really those kids, Willow and Jaden Smith.
That we give them hell.
Yeah, and even Trey. Some of the black community gives them hell, but I also look at that as like radical. You have these black youth deciding what they want to do in their lives, whether it's acting, whether it's music, whether it's producing. They decide what they want to do with their hair, whether it's whipping it around or shaving it off. They decide whether they want to participate in rock and roll or hip hop. And I'm like, yo, for the first time, I feel like I'm looking at black kids free.
Living, I think that's called autonomy. And I feel that a lot of, even outside of queerness, a lot of black culture doesn't give you autonomy because when you step out of this house, you represent everybody, which is unfair. I guess it's a safety measure too, but I feel like that got lost in translation and became culture. Like our culture is not being a representative for every black person, but we feel like we have to be that because we've had to be that since our inception in this country.
Mikey Narain of Out My Closet, welcome to Deviant TV.
Thank you so much. I'm excited.
Yes, sir. I'm excited to have you. We are on this episode of Dear Future. And can you tell us a bit about your organization, Out My Closet?
Sure. Out My Closet is a nonprofit organization that supports the most vulnerable in our community, our homeless LGBT youth, and our transgender women of color. One cool thing that we're most renowned for is our pop-up shops. So we travel to homeless shelters, drop-in feeding programs, and we create a boutique-like environment where kids are taking high fashion forward, stylish, amazing quality clothing off racks. And if you were to think about it, the level of dignity that entails choosing something, regaining that choice that I want to wear this, it aligns with my gender expression, my gender identity. It's something I like, it suits my style. And the impact that has on the mental health aspect of someone's well-being. We just celebrated 8 years of service and commitment. In addition, we've reached a new benchmark of having donated 30,000 articles of clothing, shoes, accessories, cosmetics. Because clothes are an important part of our lives, right? It protects us from the elements. It's forged our identity.
Yeah.
And also, if we have the right attire for like an interview, it adds as an aid. So that's one important thing that Out My Closet is really renowned for.
I can like really appreciate that. I'm thinking about my own experience as a queer youth as it relates to apparel, and I know that there was always a desire to be more creative and be more expressive than I was allowed. And so, you know, it goes further and beyond when you think about a non-binary or trans person who is truly made to feel uncomfortable in the clothes that, you know, society and their parents sometimes and their communities are making them put on. And so, I totally get the name now, Out My Closet. Amazing. How did you get started in that work?
So it's a long story, but it's very emotional for me because a lot of times when I tell it, it takes me back to what a lot of youth experience and face that are homeless. 8 years ago, I was a substance abuse counselor, and my patient was a young runaway from South Florida. Horrible life experiences, right? When he was a young child, he came from a home where his mom was an active drug user. She took him to a crack house and said, "Here's my child, give me drugs, and you could have your way with him." That in itself speaks a lot of volume, right? And from that experience, he was sodomized and contracted HIV, ended up running away, got involved with heavy polysubstance drug use, the amount of depression and compensating for his emotions. Additionally, he got into survival sex because I want to make a distinction of what survival sex is when you're engaging in sexual relationships because you have to. This is your means and access to resources. And as my patient, we got to speak a lot of the issues that he was facing with. And all this young man wanted was to be loved and valued and cared for. And he took his life after a gay pride weekend. And you would think that gay pride is where we celebrate our identities. But even still with, you know, that celebration, he just felt like he wanted to give up and he ended up taking his life. So I wanted to create an experience where homeless and under-resourced LGBTQ youth are able to have access and resources to like clothing and, you know, counseling, as well as create a social media presence where there's affirming content that validates their identity. So I started it because I received an email from this priest that was housing 3 runaway youth. And the community was like, "Hey, we really got to help them." So I was like, you know what, as a gay man, I know that one of the reasons I came out of the closet was because I needed more room to put for my new fashion. And then I was like, you know what, let me take all of these resources and bring it to these kids. And it was like, you know, things that they were kids my age. So there were resources that they loved, all the brands that they liked. And with that, I spent time in hearing their stories, learning about them, encouraging them.
May I ask you a hand just a second? I think that it is for us to take a moment to just acknowledge that individual and that, you know, their life inspired such great work.
It was.
And I want to, wow.
I grew up in a strong Christian home, right? I feel that I made this little slogan that God uses tragedies to devise remedies. And I speak about God and spirituality a lot because being a church kid and having to figure out my LGBT identity, there was still a strong calling over my life. One day I was in a church service and one of the deacons said, "Michael, God has a word for you. Raise up your hands and receive this word from God." He said, "I'm going to use you as a missionary to bring healing, and your hands will bring healing." And I rejected the idea because I thought about missionaries, I thought about hot temperatures, no indoor plumbing. I liked the luxuries that I had. I did not want to do that. So I rejected it. And then one day after an OMC Out My Closet event, I was driving home and then like my heart was quickened. "Michael, you're doing exactly what I called you to do. You're acting as a mobile agency, like a missionary, bringing love and hope and resources." So there is fulfillment of the word, and I embraced it, that this is a calling upon my life that I couldn't escape. But
I wanna ask you, you know, even as I'm, you know, touched by that story, how much, just so our viewers can understand, how much is that a reality for other Black and brown queer youth? Like,
homelessness?
Yeah.
Alrighty. Here's a really sad statistic, right? 40% of youth that are engaged in social services identify as an LGBT youth, as an LGBT person, right? So you have to think about the general population. There's way more heterosexual individuals than there are homo LGBT population. So that percentage is much higher.
Yeah.
And with that comes other aspects of health, like mental health. The amount of suicidal ideations is much higher. The mental, physical, sexual traumas are much higher in the LGBT youth population as well. So we are affected way much more than normal heterosexual and or just cis people.
Yeah, and thank you for illustrating that, because I don't know if people really understand. We're talking about, this subject matter is dear future. We're talking about youth. We're talking about young people who have no blame, and they deserve a full life, a whole life. And to illustrate that they will face homelessness, that they will face contemplating suicide. Like, what must your reality be as a young person to contemplate that? And when you hear the alarming numbers of queer youth that will contemplate things like suicide, it really lets us know that something has to be done. And so I was talking with my co-host about how we can reimagine our future to begin saving our own, because so what the society doesn't have the systems in place, right? So what that these queer youth family may disown them. Those are our babies as a community. And so I applaud that you are a person within our community that is creating a safety net for us, by us. And as you continue to grow out my closet and reimagine safety nets in our future, what does that look like for you?
It really has to start with individuals, right? Before we think about systems, we have to think about the family unit first. What conversations have to be had? We could all, as an LGBT member, I'm a gunkle. I am always advocating for the younger generations, meaning right conversations or how to address certain questions. Like recently, one of my godchildren decided to identify as they, and the mom was just like, it's one thing to be cool with LGBT people, but when it's now in your family unit, it's a little different because, it may be okay to have a relative that's gay, but not your own child. Now, so I had to initiate the conversation about acceptance and identity. And sometimes I feel like if you are an LGBT person or an ally and you could pick up on certain cues, I would step in and be an advocate in those situations. And really say, hey, if your child is, what would you think? Or and just bring the knowledge that about what they could possibly be exposed to if you do kick them out, or what other trials and struggles they may have. So it really starts with the family unit. The other aspect is that within the school systems, there are resources. So you being an advocate within your family system, like, hey, have you talked about LGBT issues with maybe a peer group in your school or a counselor? Also bringing resources that are online. There are lots of websites and organizations out there in the social service, social media aspect that has resources and tidbits that are life-saving.
We're gonna get ready to wrap soon, but before we do, I'm gonna ask you to do a slight practice with me.
Okay.
Close your eyes. The individual we were talking about before, you get an opportunity to speak to them now. Just what would you say to that person in this future that you're creating for them?
For the person that is facing all of this, I would say your life matters. Everything that you are experiencing and you feel are wrong are valuable. You are so important. You are different for a reason. Not everyone is meant to be alike, and all that you are experiencing now, the darkness, you will be propelled and led to a place where you could then show light to others who was once or will be in the dark, because you've been there and you've experienced so much, and now you are much stronger and you are hope for someone. It's really deep when you look at those dark areas in our lives and can't possibly see hope at that time. But when you're let out and let up, you're able to shine light and bring guidance.
And yeah, and Mikey, you and Out My Closet are being a beacon of light for so many others. Please let our viewers know where they can find you on social media, find you on the web. Yeah.
Sure. Hi, friends. So we love to have you join our mission. It takes just one action to help. You could learn more about Out My Closet at www.outmycloset.org, which will lead you to all our social media handles. So check out the website, and we're linked to most social media networks.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mikey.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Such
Yeah.
a pleasure. Thank you. Yeah, but what would it mean for us to realize and actualize the individuals that we actually are? I want to ask you, how do you see our future? What in your wildest imagination could you imagine being a safety net in a system to advocate and possibly save some Black queer youth from this homelessness, this suicide, and these alarming statistics that we talked about?
Like we have had to do traditionally as Black people, we have to step out and advocate for ourselves without hate. It should not be the oppression Olympics. Like, okay, you get this amount of freedom, but not you. Like, you can't cut off a piece of the body and still claim to have a whole body. I feel like we should have just people being able to identify as people. It doesn't harm anyone to identify how you want to identify.
Yeah.
So I hope for the future that people like Zaya, I hope that mindset of, oh, I didn't even know, can permeate through the bigger culture.
Yeah.
And I don't want to lose things that we have struggled to get. I know even in the Black Panther movement, they were saying queer people should have rights, Asian people should have rights. And they actually fought for these things and said those outspokenly.
Yeah.
And they did that knowing that you can have an army of a few people, you can have an army of these straight men trying to fight all oppression, which we know they don't. Or you can have this bigger, beautiful rainbow of people fighting for the same goal.
Yeah. And I love that you bring up the Black Liberation Movement, because I do know that historically, at our roots, we were a united front who understood that oppression was really the thing that we needed to dismantle. And now it seems like everybody, at least within the Black community and beyond, are in a race to just gain their own privileges and their own their own privilege. Like, nobody's actually doing that work of dismantling oppression, whether it looks like just poverty in general, whether it looks like racism or homophobia or transphobia.
We gotta talk about Black straight men. I don't want to put that all on. I don't want to put everything on, because there are Black straight men who are out here great.
Yeah.
But then there are ones that are spreading ignorance. The ones, especially our entertainment. I hate that every time we have an issue in politics, we send a rapper to the White House. And I'm like, well, they have influence, but they don't have political power. They aren't teaching people how to be mobile. They just have influence.
Yeah.
And they have influence over a small section of this culture. And I think that's done purposefully. It gives that one person an ego trip. Like, I am the culture, but the culture is suffering.
Yeah, the culture is suffering, and we also know that we in our community play a huge part in propping up the culture and the community as a whole. So it is time that we get more visible, that we get more vocal, and do what you said in creating systems, advocating for structures that would be safety nets for our own youth and for ourselves. Yeah.
Black men loving Black men is a revolutionary act. Black people loving Black people is a revolutionary act. And I think we can just hope for the future to continue that. If you're out here and you're young and you are just looking for some kind of resource, you can tell them where to go.
Yes. So deviant.live/play is where you can find this and many other episodes. You can also find a survey where you can tell us what you want to hear, what you want to know about. We can also make certain to include those resources that you're talking about. At least for now, you can also access deviant.live/safety to find health partners and resources in your local area if you are a youth or just a Black queer person looking for community. Of course, we have our Deviant events where we welcome folks once a month in Atlanta, DC, and the New York area. But again, deviant.live to access more information. Thank you all for joining us today, and looking forward to seeing you again. Niggas be gay.
Until next time. You said niggas be gay?
Niggas be gay.